What if I told you that one of the greatest empires of the medieval world, powerful, wealthy, and seemingly untouchable, was brought to its knees not by numbers, not by superior weapons, but by the cunning mind of a single man? And what if I revealed that the tactics he unleashed during this campaign were so devastating, so brilliantly calculated, that they reshaped the course of history forever? This is the story of Genghis Khan and the battle against the Khwarazm Empire. An empire that, at its height, commanded vast trade routes, glittering cities, and armies that dwarfed those of most of its neighbors. Yet in a matter of years, it would crumble under the relentless pressure of Mongol strategy, leaving its land scarred, its people scattered, and its rulers erased from the annals of power. But how? How did an upstart nomadic force from the steppes outthink, outmaneuver, and ultimately destroy a mighty civilization that believed itself invincible? Stay with me, because what you're about to hear isn't just another tale of conquest. It's a story of betrayal, psychological warfare, and genius tactics that left the world stunned. And if you want to uncover the secrets of how Genghis Khan crushed an empire once thought unbreakable, make sure you watch until the very end, because the revelations might just change how you see history itself. The spark that lit the inferno. What would you do if a single insult had the power to change the destiny of nations? And what if one arrogant decision, made in a moment of pride, doomed an empire that had taken centuries to build? These questions lie at the heart of the clash between Genghis Khan and the Khwarazm Empire, a war born not only from ambition but also from betrayal, greed, and hubris. The story begins in the early 13th century. By this time, Genghis Khan had transformed his Mongol tribes from scattered clans of herdsmen into a rising power feared across Asia. The Mongols were already known for their speed, ferocity, and discipline, but their leader had ambitions that went beyond raiding villages and capturing pastureland. Genghis Khan envisioned a vast dominion stretching across the known world, one that would command not only the steppes, but also the great trade routes that carried silk, spices, and wealth from China to the Middle East and Europe. Standing directly in his path was the Khwarazm Empire, ruled by Shah Ala ad-Din Muhammad II. The Shah commanded a realm that stretched from the deserts of modern-day Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan to the rich cities of Persia. His empire was prosperous, positioned along the Silk Road, and filled with fortified cities boasting thriving bazaars and grand mosques. To most rulers of the time, Khwarazm seemed untouchable. Its armies were numerous, its wealth immense, and its cities a web of defenses that had endured centuries of warlords and invaders. But Genghis Khan was not most rulers. Rather than storming into Khwarazm with violence, he began with something far subtler: diplomacy. In 1218, he sent a caravan of merchants across the desert, laden with valuable goods, fine silks, and rare treasures. The message was clear: the Mongols did not seek war, but trade. Genghis Khan offered friendship and commerce, hoping to tie the Khwarazm Empire to him through mutual prosperity. At first glance, this was a gesture of peace. But beneath it lay a strategy as sharp as any blade. Trade meant alliances, alliances meant access, and access meant power. If Khwarazm agreed, Genghis Khan would gain a foothold into the heart of Persia without spilling a drop of blood. Yet if they refused, it would give him the justification he needed to unleash his armies. The caravan never reached its true potential because fate, or rather arrogance, intervened. At the border city of Otrar, the Shah's governor seized the merchants, accused them of spying, and had them executed. When word of this outrage reached Genghis Khan, the great Khan was furious but measured. Instead of immediately retaliating, he sent 3 ambassadors directly to the Shah himself, demanding an explanation and offering a chance to mend relations. But the Shah chose pride over wisdom. One of the envoys was killed, the others humiliated and sent back. In the world of the steppes, where honor and loyalty were everything, such an act was unforgivable. By executing merchants and insulting ambassadors, Shah Muhammad had crossed a line he could never retreat from. This was the spark that lit the inferno. The Mongols. Vengeance was not merely an act of justice. It was a matter of survival. If Genghis Khan allowed such an insult to stand, other kingdoms might view the Mongols as weak, their authority as fragile. For a man who had clawed his way to the top by uniting warring tribes under a single banner, Weakness was death. And so, the Khan prepared to strike back with a fury the world had never seen. But here is where the genius of Genghis Khan began to shine. Instead of charging blindly into Khwarazm with brute force, he studied his enemy. He knew the Shah commanded a massive empire, but it was brittle, its territories vast and hard to control, its people divided by ethnicity and culture, and its ruler notorious for paranoia. Shah Muhammad trusted no one, not even his own generals. He kept his armies scattered, fearing rebellion more than invasion, and his court was riddled with intrigue and betrayal. Genghis Khan saw all this. He understood that he would not need to fight Khwarazm's strength directly. He would simply exploit its weaknesses. His strategy would not just be about battles. It would be about breaking the Shah's mind, sowing terror in his people, and collapsing the empire from within. The Mongols began their march westward, a vast horde of riders moving like a storm across the steppes. But unlike the Shah, Genghis Khan kept his forces united, disciplined, and bound by a single vision. As they approached the borders of Khwarazm, whispers of their ferocity spread ahead of them. Tales of Mongol riders who never tired, of arrows that fell like rain, of cities swallowed whole in a single night. Rumors fanned into flames of fear, and yet the Shah still underestimated them. To him, these were mere barbarians, nomadic horsemen who might harass a border town but could never threaten the great cities of Persia. He had no idea that what was coming was not just a war, but a catastrophe that would erase his empire from history. The stage was set. The insult at Otrar had been answered not with forgiveness, but with vengeance. And Genghis Khan was ready to demonstrate tactics so brilliant, so merciless, that they would echo through the centuries. But how did a people of the steppes, with no great cities of their own, tear through the walls of the richest empire in the Islamic world? What tactics allowed them to crush armies many times their size? And what psychological warfare did they wield to shatter the will of entire populations before the first arrow was even loosed? The answers lie in the battles that followed, each one a masterpiece of deception, discipline, and ruthless calculation. And as the Mongol horde swept into Khwarazm, the world would witness not just a conquest, but the birth of a legend. The storm breaks. What happens when arrogance blinds a ruler to the storm gathering on his borders? And how can the fear of shadows, more than the clash of steel, bring down an empire thought to be eternal? These questions hovered over the Khwarazm Empire in 1219. As the Mongol horde advanced like a living tide, why now? Shah Ala ad-Din Muhammad had received word that Genghis Khan's armies were moving west, and yet he still could not comprehend the scale of what was coming. To him, the Mongols were fierce raiders, but they were still nomads, horsemen who thrived in the open steppe, not in the world of walled cities and siege warfare. Surely, he thought, the riches of Samarkand, Bukhara, and Nishapur would be safe behind their towering walls. Surely no steppe warrior could master the arts of siege engines, sapping, and stone-breaking towers. Surely the empire would hold, but Genghis Khan had already prepared for this exact miscalculation. Years earlier, he had absorbed knowledge from captured engineers in China, masters of siegecraft who knew how to topple fortresses with catapults, trebuchets, and ingenious devices of destruction. He had not only taken their skills, he had bound them to his cause. Wherever the Mongols marched, these engineers marched with them, bringing the terror of the East to the walls of the West. The Shah's confidence in his cities would soon prove a deadly illusion. The first great confrontation came at Otrar, the city whose governor had executed the Mongol merchants. Genghis Khan could have bypassed it, but vengeance demanded a statement. The siege began with relentless ferocity. For 5 months, the city resisted, but the Mongols never relented. They built siege towers, hurled stones, and cut off every supply line. Inside, the people starved and despaired, while outside, the Mongols encircled them like wolves around a cornered prey. When Otrar finally fell, it was not just destroyed, it was obliterated. The governor who had insulted the Khan was executed in the most brutal manner. Molten silver poured into his eyes and ears as a symbol of his greed and betrayal. It was a warning written in blood and fire. No insult to the Mongols would go unanswered. From Otrar, the Mongol storm swept south. Their next target was the glittering jewel of Bukhara, one of the richest cities of the empire, known for its scholars, merchants, and towering minarets. The people of Bukhara had always believed their city untouchable, protected by mighty walls and a strong garrison. Yet when the Mongols appeared, they brought with them a tactic unlike any seen before: fear itself. Before a single stone was launched, the Mongols spread rumors, whispering of massacres, of cities burned to the ground, of enemies vanishing in the night. Refugees fleeing Otrar carried tales of horror, and when they reached Bukhara, panic spread faster than arrows could fly. By the time the Mongols arrived, many defenders had already abandoned their posts. When Genghis Khan himself entered the city, he reportedly rode straight into the mosque and declared, "I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." Bukhara fell swiftly, its riches looted, its people enslaved, its prestige shattered. What shocked the world was not just the fall of the city, but the speed and precision with which the Mongols achieved it. To the people of Khwarazm, it seemed impossible. How could men who lived in tents, who herded sheep across the steppe, now command the power to break the gates of the greatest cities of Islam? The truth lay in Genghis Khan's genius for organization and deception. His armies never moved as a single, lumbering force. Instead, they spread out in smaller divisions, striking in multiple directions, confusing the enemy about their true numbers. They feigned retreats to lure garrisons into ambushes. They used captured soldiers and defectors to spread false intelligence, tricking Shah Muhammad into scattering his armies further and further apart. As the Mongols advanced, city after city crumbled. Samarkand, the Shah's prized jewel, boasted tens of thousands of defenders, yet when the Mongols arrived, its strength collapsed within days. The defenders had been promised safety if they surrendered, but when they attempted to resist, the wrath of the Khan fell upon them. Tens of thousands were executed, and their bodies left as warnings to the next city in line. Terror became the Mongols' sharpest weapon, sharper even than their arrows. And what of Shah Muhammad? As his cities fell one after another, he revealed the fatal flaw that would doom his empire: cowardice. Rather than rally his armies and confront the Mongols, he fled. He abandoned his people, his generals, and his throne, retreating further west with every Mongol victory. He trusted no one, suspecting betrayal at every corner, and thus he paralyzed his own command structure. The empire that had once stretched proudly across Central Asia now stood leaderless, fractured, and vulnerable. Yet the Mongols were not content with victory on the battlefield alone. They pursued the Shah relentlessly, sending detachments across deserts and mountains to hunt him down. No place was safe, not even the Caspian Sea islands where he attempted to hide. The Shah eventually died in despair, alone and exiled, his empire shattered beyond repair. But the story does not end with his death. For Genghis Khan, the war was not merely about punishing a single ruler. It was about sending a message to the entire world. Resistance would mean annihilation. Submission would mean survival. By the time the Mongols had finished their campaign in Khwarazm, entire cities had been wiped from the map, populations decimated, and the once mighty empire erased as though it had never existed. The brilliance of Genghis Khan's tactics lay not only in the battles themselves, but in the psychological devastation he inflicted. The Mongols made examples of their enemies, ensuring that the next kingdom to face them would think twice before raising its banners in defiance. This was not merely conquest. It was a calculated performance of terror and power. But how did Genghis Khan instill such absolute loyalty in his men? Forging an army that never wavered, even in the face of overwhelming odds. And what secrets lay behind the unity of the Mongol horde when so many other empires had collapsed under their own divisions? The answer lies in the foundations of Mongol discipline, the bonds of brotherhood forged in the harsh steppes, and the iron will of a leader who demanded and received total devotion. The fall of Khwarazm was not just the destruction of a single empire. It was the opening act of a far greater saga, the rise of the Mongols as the most feared and unstoppable force the world had ever seen. The iron bond of the horde. What kind of leader could take tribes who had once lived in endless blood feuds and turn them into a single fist that could crush empires? And what force bound the Mongol warriors so tightly together that they would ride into certain death at the mere command of one man? The answer lies not only in Genghis Khan's genius on the battlefield, but in the iron discipline loyalty, and shared vision he instilled in his horde. Long before he faced the Khwarazm Empire, Genghis Khan, then still known as Temujin, had grown up amidst betrayal and hardship. His father was poisoned by enemies, his family cast out into the wilderness, his youth scarred by hunger and danger. He knew firsthand the cruelty of fractured tribes and the chaos of divided leadership. From these trials, Temujin drew a lesson that would shape his destiny. Unity was survival. If the clans could not be bound together, they would always be prey for stronger neighbors. If they could be united, they would become unstoppable. That be why the time he became Genghis Khan, he had already forged a new order among the Mongols. No longer would loyalty be dictated solely by blood ties. Instead, loyalty was to him, the Khan, and to the nation of the Mongols as a whole. Warriors who had once fought as rivals now stood as brothers in arms, bound by laws and codes that emphasized merit, discipline, and unbreakable unity. This transformation was the foundation of the horde that descended upon Khwarazm. Unlike the Shah's armies, which were swollen with mercenaries, fragmented by mistrust, and ruled by fear of betrayal, the Mongols operated like a single body. Orders flowed swiftly from the Khan to his generals, and from the generals to the Tumans, the units of 10,000 men that formed the backbone of the Mongol army. Each Tuman was divided into smaller groups, down to squads of 10, ensuring that every soldier was part of a tightly controlled chain of command. But more than structure, there was devotion. Genghis Khan demanded, and received, absolute loyalty. To break an oath was death, and to fail one's brothers was shame worse than death. Yet he also rewarded loyalty richly. A common herdsman could rise to become a general if his courage and skill proved worthy. This meritocracy inspired fierce commitment, for every man knew that his place in the horde was not chained by birth, but earned by valor. It was this unity that made Mongol tactics so devastating. On the battlefield, they moved with a precision that astonished their enemies. Feigned retreats were carried out flawlessly, with no man breaking ranks even under pressure. Encirclements, ambushes, and coordinated assaults unfolded as if the horde were a single living organism. Where other armies crumbled into chaos when pressed, the Mongols struck with calm, ruthless efficiency. Psychological warfare also thrived under this unity. The Mongols understood the power of fear better than any army in history. They deliberately spared those who surrendered without resistance, sometimes even allowing them to live under Mongol rule with minimal disruption. But those who resisted were met with unimaginable destruction. Cities that defied the Khan were annihilated, their populations slaughtered, and the ruins left as grim monuments for all who might think to resist. Survivors, often just a handful, were deliberately allowed to flee, carrying tales of terror to the next city. Thus, the Mongols conquered not only with arrows and swords, but with stories and shadows. Yet behind this mask of ruthlessness was also pragmatism. Genghis Khan valued knowledge and skill wherever he found it. After the conquest of Khwarazm began, artisans, engineers, and scholars were often spared and absorbed into the Mongol system. Persian scribes became administrators. Chinese engineers built siege engines. Even Islamic astronomers were brought into Mongol service, guiding them with maps of the stars. For the Khan, every useful skill strengthened his vision of empire, and every mind he captured became another weapon in his arsenal. The Shah of Khwarazm could never match this blend of terror, loyalty, and pragmatism. While his generals quarreled and his soldiers doubted, the Mongols moved with unwavering purpose. The contrast was stark. One empire divided against itself, the other united under a single will. It was not just tactics that brought the Khwarazm Empire down. It was the iron bond of the Mongol horde, a bond forged by hardship, loyalty, and the relentless drive of their Khan. But the most terrifying truth was yet to unfold. The Mongols did not merely come to conquer and plunder. They came to erase. The destruction of Khwarazm would not end with its city's collapse, nor with the Shah's desperate flight into exile. Genghis Khan was not satisfied with defeating his enemy. He sought to make them vanish from history, to wipe the very memory of Khwarazm from the face of the earth. How does one annihilate an empire so thoroughly that its name becomes little more than a ghost in forgotten chronicles? And what price did the common people, merchants, farmers, families, pay for the arrogance of their ruler? The answers lie in the final chapter of the Khwarazm tragedy, when Genghis Khan unleashed the full fury of his vengeance and left behind a wasteland where once an empire had stood. The wrath of the Khan: what happens when victory is not enough, when a conqueror decides that an entire people must be erased as punishment for the sins of their ruler. And how far will vengeance carry an empire that wields terror as its sharpest blade? These questions hung heavy over the shattered cities of Khwarazm as the Mongol storm reached its most merciless stage. By the time Shah Ala ad-Din Muhammad fled into exile, his empire was already fractured beyond repair. Yet Genghis Khan was not content to let the remnants linger. For him, the insult at Otrar and the betrayal of his envoys demanded not just retribution, but annihilation. He would turn the Khwarazm Empire into an example so horrifying that no other kingdom would ever dare to defy him. The campaign became a whirlwind of devastation. After Bukhara and Samarkand fell, the Mongols moved deeper into Persian lands. Each city became a test of submission or destruction. Those that opened their gates were often spared outright slaughter, those stripped of wealth and forced into Mongol service. Those that resisted met an end so absolute it was as though they had never existed. Take Nishapur, for instance. The city resisted bravely, but in the chaos of battle, Genghis Khan's beloved son-in-law was killed. When word reached the Khan's daughter, she demanded vengeance so complete that it would wipe Nishapur from the earth. The Mongols descended upon the city with pitiless wrath. Tens of thousands were slaughtered, the earth soaked in blood, and the city leveled to rubble. Chroniclers later wrote that even the dogs and cats were slain, leaving nothing alive within the walls. Whether exaggerated or not, the tale spread like wildfire, magnifying the aura of terror that traveled with the Mongol name. But it was not just slaughter that made the Mongols infamous. It was the precision of their cruelty. Cities were methodically emptied, artisans separated from common folk, and every resource stripped before the flames rose. Skilled workers were marched eastward to serve the Khan, while the rest were often left in mass graves. This cold efficiency was part of Genghis Khan's larger vision. Conquest was not mere chaos. It was an instrument of empire building. Meanwhile, the Shah's flight became a humiliation that haunted the Islamic world. Pursued by Mongol detachments, he fled from city to city, abandoning his people with each desperate step. Eventually, he died on an island in the Caspian Sea, a fugitive king stripped of throne and dignity. His empire had collapsed not just under the Mongol assault, but under his own cowardice. To Genghis Khan, his death was almost anticlimactic. The real punishment had already been carried out on the lands he left behind. The Mongols pressed onward, dividing their forces into multiple columns that spread destruction across Central Asia and Persia. Like a wildfire driven by the wind, they struck in every direction, giving the impression of an unstoppable tide. Even when cities tried to rally, they often found themselves ambushed by Mongol trickery, false retreats, hidden reserves, and devastating cavalry charges that broke armies many times larger than the Mongols themselves. And yet, amidst this destruction, Genghis Khan showed a side that confounded his enemies. He was merciless to those who resisted, but pragmatic with those who submitted. Many cities that surrendered without bloodshed were integrated into the Mongol system, their leaders spared, their people allowed to live. Some even prospered under Mongol rule, paying tribute but continuing their trade and daily lives. This contrast between mercy and annihilation was itself a weapon, for no ruler could ever be sure which fate awaited them. Surrender might mean survival. Resistance almost certainly meant extinction. By the end of the Khwarazm campaign, the once mighty empire had ceased to exist. Its cities were burned, its people scattered, its ruler dead in disgrace. The Silk Road, once dotted with flourishing towns, now lay in ruins. Where caravans had once carried silks and spices, vultures now circled over empty streets and charred walls. The devastation was so complete that even centuries later, travelers would pass through desolate ruins and speak of the wrath of the Khan. But Genghis Khan was not finished. To him, the fall of Khwarazm was only the beginning. He had proven that no empire, no matter how wealthy or fortified, could withstand the will of the Mongols. Yet beyond the ashes of Khwarazm lay new horizons. Persia, the Middle East, and even the far-off kingdoms of Europe. Still, the campaign left behind more than conquest. It left a lesson written in fire, that arrogance, division, and betrayal could doom even the strongest of empires. For the people of Khwarazm, it was a tragedy beyond measure. For Genghis Khan, it was vindication, proof that his vision of unity, discipline, and fear could remake the world. But the story does not end here. For while the Khwarazm campaign cemented Genghis Khan's reputation as the scourge of God, it also set into motion a chain of events that would bring him into contact with powers far greater and more distant. The Islamic world reeled, Christian Europe began to take notice, and rumors of the Mongols spread across the globe like thunder rolling before a storm. What happens when a force of destruction born in the steppes meets the civilizations of the West, armed with knights, castles, and crusader zeal? And could even Genghis Khan's genius sustain such relentless conquest, or would his empire collapse under the weight of its own ambition? The answers lie in the next chapter of the Mongol saga, when the wrath unleashed on Khwarazm carried the Khan's armies further than anyone in history could have imagined. Legacy written in fire and blood, what remains when an empire is erased from the earth? And what legacy does a conqueror leave when his vengeance not only destroys a people, but reshapes the map of the known world? These are the haunting questions that linger after the fall of the Khwarazm Empire. Questions that echo in the shadow of Genghis Khan's campaign of annihilation, by the time the Mongol horde withdrew from the ruins of Khwarazm. The empire that had once stood as a beacon of wealth and power was gone. Its ruler, Shah Ala ad-Din Muhammad, had died in exile, his name remembered not as a mighty king, but as a coward who abandoned his people in their hour of need. Its cities, Samarkand, Bukhara, Nishapur, Otrar, lay in ruins, their people scattered, enslaved, or slain. The empire's proud role as guardian of the Silk Road was no more. The arteries of trade that had once carried goods and ideas across Asia now pulsed under Mongol control. But for Genghis Khan, this was not simply a campaign of revenge. It was a demonstration, a message to the entire world. The Khwarazm catastrophe became a warning etched in blood. The Mongols were not raiders to be dismissed, not nomads to be mocked, but a force that demanded fear, respect, and submission. Wherever word of their conquest spread, rulers trembled. In Baghdad, in Damascus, in Constantinople, in the courts of Europe, whispers of the Mongols arrived before their armies, sowing dread in kings and caliphs alike. The brilliance of Genghis Khan's tactics was that he understood conquest as more than the taking of land. He knew that psychological domination was as vital as military victory. By utterly destroying Khwarazm, he created a myth of Mongol invincibility, a legend that paralyzed future enemies before the first arrow was even drawn. Cities would later surrender without a fight, not because they lacked defenses, but because they remembered what had happened to Khwarazm. Fear itself became his empire's most potent weapon. Yet the legacy of this campaign is not only one of terror. It is also one of transformation. From the ruins of Khwarazm, Genghis Khan began building the framework of an empire that would span continents. He absorbed administrators, engineers, and scholars into his service, weaving their skills into the fabric of Mongol rule. The knowledge of Persia flowed eastward, merging with the wisdom of China, creating a bridge between civilizations that had long been separated. In his ruthless way, Genghis Khan was not only a destroyer, but also a unifier of worlds. Still, for the people who suffered under his wrath, the devastation could never be forgotten. The scale of the slaughter left wounds that lasted generations. Entire cities vanished, and entire cultures were scarred. For them, the Mongols were not builders of empire, but horsemen of the apocalypse, a scourge sent by God to punish their sins. The dual image of Genghis Khan, as visionary statesman and merciless destroyer, was born in the ashes of Khwarazm and would define how the world remembered him for centuries to come. As for the Khan himself, the fall of Khwarazm was proof of his belief that no empire was beyond his reach. His armies would march further still, into Persia, into the Middle East, even probing the edges of Europe. The campaign against Khwarazm was both a climax and a beginning. The moment when Genghis Khan transcended his role as steppe warlord and became a figure of world history, feared and remembered on every continent. And so the story closes. not with peace, but with the thunder of hooves fading into the horizon. Genghis Khan had crushed an empire once thought unbreakable, and in doing so, he had carved his name into the stone of history. The ruins of Khwarazm whispered of his vengeance, the survivors carried tales of his cruelty, and the future bore the imprint of his vision. But the questions linger still. Was he a monster or a genius? A destroyer or a maker of worlds? Could the Khwarazm Empire have survived had its ruler chosen wisdom over arrogance, unity over pride? And what lessons should we take from this tale of fire and blood, centuries later, in our own world of fragile powers and uncertain alliances? Perhaps the answer lies in the Khan's own words, or at least those attributed to him. I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you. The fall of Khwarazm reminds us that history is not only shaped by armies and kings, but by choices that can lead to survival or destruction, unity or ruin. For Genghis Khan, the insult at Ochre was more than a diplomatic slight. It was the spark that lit an inferno, one that consumed an empire and left behind a legend. And so, as the dust settled and the steppe winds swept over the ruins, the world was left with a truth it could not deny. Genghis Khan was not merely a conqueror. He was a force of nature. And the empire of Khwarazm, once mighty and proud, was but the first to be swept away by the storm.